Will you pray with me? Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be accepted to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. That scriptural passage that Jack just read for us this morning should be very familiar to many of us. The words are slightly different from Jesus's, but the heart of the message is the same. It's the statement we share each time we leave worship. If you are a Sunday morning regular, you can probably recite it by memory. So I'm going to invite those who can to say it with me now, and for those who can't, hint, it's in the back of your bulletin. So let's go to the commission and let's share it together. God has anointed us to bear good news to the afflicted, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom to the captives, to open the prisons of those who are bound. Let us go forth in the name of Christ, to bring peace into broken relationships, healing to alienated persons, and justice into oppressive structures. Think about the import of those words for a moment. That is some seriously powerful stuff. Life-changing, world-changing stuff. Good news, freedom, sight, healing, hope. And perhaps we hear it so much that its power is lost on us. But think about it. If we were to actually live even a fraction of this commission, our lives, our community, our world would be a completely different place. Now, as familiar as it may be to some of us, many of us probably didn't know that we borrowed it from Jesus, and even more probably didn't know that Jesus borrowed it from the prophet Isaiah. But I will tell you this, we still speak these words 2.5 millennia after Isaiah because these words have legs. They remind us that we are part of a line of prophetic communities who feel called to do a radical thing, perhaps the most radical thing. Speak hope into despair. And not just to speak about hope, but to embody it. Not just to cry about brokenness, but to heal it. And not just complain about injustice, but to actively work against it. And that's a tall order, both the speaking of it and the doing of it. And let me tell you, the getting off the couch part is not something that many of us do well, myself very much included. For in a world of virtual relationships, isn't it so much easier to tweet a prophetic stand than to live one? Easier to share a radical Facebook status than to take to the streets? Less risky to wear a button that says Black Lives Matter than for those of us who are white to let go of our privilege. So we thank God for her extravagant grace and forgiveness when we fall short, which is always. And we come back here the next Sunday and we try it again. But no matter how imperfectly we may live out this commission, I know that it matters to us here in this church because when we neglect to say it, if for some reason we end worship differently with a song or a prayer or even a moment of sacred silence, back in that line, I hear about it. Please tell me we will say it again next week. I need to hear these words to get my heart right for Monday morning. And I get it. Because the truth is, we don't hear words like this too often the other 6 days of the week. The other 6 days, as Wendy illustrated with the children, the other 6 days, in a myriad of little ways, we hear something more like this. God has anointed us to mind our own business, to put convenience before conscience, to let fear speak louder than compassion, to shut the door on our neighbor if they don't look like us. Now, maybe that's a bit too cynical, but not by much. Our human default is set to self-preservation and conformity and the status quo. Change is scary, and change that interrupts our comfort or our privilege is downright terrifying, which is why I believe Jesus chose this passage for his very first sermon, his first one. For essentially, Jesus here is delivering his mission statement. He's speaking truth to power, and he's laying out his agenda for his ministry. And for those of us who follow him, Jesus is the human face of God. So when we hear these words, we are hearing God's priorities. Quoting from Isaiah, standing in the midst of his family and friends in his hometown synagogue, Jesus is aligning himself with God's story of justice and liberation and hope that is woven within the story of the Hebrew people. He's reminding them of where they come from and what they've gone through, and where God is still inviting them to go. But this is not a past tense message. It's for us too, 21st century Christians here in Montclair, New Jersey. Can we hear it now? In the world as we know it, in the days that we experience? What comes to mind for us when we hear words like poor and captive and blind and oppressed? Are they too broad and too vague to touch our hearts? Do we see statistics instead of faces? I'm sure that these words had some very specific and immediate meanings for Jesus' congregation. But how about us? How do they speak to us? So what if we heard Jesus say the message this way? Listen up, people. For God has sent me to bring good news to the thirsty, neglected people of Flint, Michigan. God has sent me to forgive your payday loans and rescue your underwater mortgages and erase your crippling student debt. God has sent me to restore the dignity of those who have lost it all and those who think they need it all. What if he told us that he's come to bring freedom to those who are addicted to the bottle or the needle or the laptop? To release those wrongly imprisoned from a justice system that is too often unjust? That he has come to save us from our need to compete and prove and compare ourselves with one another? And what if he stood here, right in this beautiful pulpit, and told us that he has come to give us sight, to change how we see those whose abilities differ from our own, to illuminate that which is of God in each of us, to give us a glimpse of heaven here and now? Ultimately, what if in the middle of all our divisive politics, our red state, blue state rhetoric, our narrow religion, and our racial profiling, what if Jesus stood here and announced that he has come to allow us to see ourselves as God does? To see that there is really no longer a them, but only an us. If Jesus put it that way, could we hear him a little bit clearer? Could we feel just how radical this message is, and would we be willing to sign on to it? Certainly, this mission statement is dramatically different from an understanding of God's priorities than what we find in our conventional wisdom or religion or politics. And no doubt it stunned and challenged his first century congregation the same way it might stun and challenge us. Our human imaginations are so limited. And we're so often stuck in an either-or way of seeing the world, so often reluctant to let go of our fears and biases and insecurities that we cling to, that we can rarely see that the radically inclusive good news God offers is for all of us. It's hard to see it even when it is staring us in the face, which is exactly what Jesus was doing, staring them in the face. Today, he says, this vision is fulfilled in your hearing. Or other words, the waiting is over. The vision is real. It's here, it's now, and I'm bringing it. Pin, drop, silence. At first. This is not what the hometown crowd was expecting from mild-mannered Jesus, and they are a little bit stunned, but not for long. It starts, you know how it starts, with a couple of whispers, and then it moves into a mass grumble, and then it becomes an angry mob. Just who does Jesus think he is? Why, just a couple of months ago, he was a regular guy from the neighborhood, Joseph's son, a carpenter. He was taking care of his mother, minding the family business, reining in his wayward brothers. Okay, maybe he read the Torah a little bit too much. Maybe he was a little intense, but he was a nice boy. a nice quiet boy. And then he goes to see his crazy cousin and he gets baptized. He goes camping by himself for 40 days, and the next thing you know, he thinks he's God's anointed. The chutzpah. And then it turns ugly. Real ugly. Throw him off a cliff, ugly. I think of all the sacrifices that a prophet makes. Giving up your familiar, safe identity must be the hardest. It can't be easy to be unwelcome in your hometown. It can't feel good to have your family and friends question your sanity. Scary and lonely to be the only one in the room who seems to see things that others do not. And yet the cost of keeping your truth silent is far worse than any of that. As Pastor Nadia Boltz-Weber reminds us, Jesus stands in that synagogue fresh from the wilderness where for 40 days he was battling his demons, alone, hungry, and tired, listening to Satan whisper in his ear, "You can have everything you want, and I'll make it so easy. You can have authority and Twitter followers and stock options and influence. If only you worship me and not God." But Jesus knew false promises when he heard them. And so after 40 days of fasting and isolation and wrestling with his darkness until the light broke through, he had a few things to say. The experience had radicalized him. For once you have been let in on God's vision for the world, you can't unsee it. You can't ignore it. Once you have faced down your demons and realized that God is waiting for you on the other side with promises of a real life, you can't go back to life as you knew it. Pretending is not an option. No matter how many people you may offend, no matter how it might affect your job or your relationships or your 401k, no matter how risky or uncertain or quite frankly dangerous the path ahead may be, you are on it and there is no turning back. And hear me, there is not a single prophet, ancient or modern, who wants this. Many will go to great distances to try and outrun it. Think about Moses hiding in Midian or Jonah jumping ship. And you'd better believe the devil was offering Jesus an escape hatch out there in the desert. But the arms of God are long, and the vision of God is compelling. Once God's truth has been planted on your heart, you must share it. To keep silence would be to deny yourself, your calling, and the vision that God has for the world. Jesus' prophetic vision of that world and the risks he was willing to take to share it with us is why he was nailed to that cross. It's why he was executed by the state like a common criminal, accused of disturbing the peace of the Roman Empire. It's the price of being a prophet. In just a couple weeks, we will be entering the season of Lent, our 40 days, which lead us through the wilderness, so that we might come face to face with our demons, so that we might wrestle in our darkness and find God's truth and light on the other side. Sometimes this wrestling requires that we get quiet and listen. And sometimes it requires that we get courageous and speak out and step up and live our commission, Jesus' mission, in ways that might feel uncomfortable, risky, and even dangerous to us. But friends, we are not alone. And once we have seen God's vision for our world, a vision of freedom and hope and healing, we cannot unsee it. So this morning, when we leave this place, let's say our commission with newfound awareness for just how radical it is and just how hopeful it is. And then, after an imperfect week, let's come back here and do it again. Because these words have legs, and this mission is why we are here. We don't have to wait any longer. Jesus has brought it. So now let's live it, knowing that it has been fulfilled here today in our hearing. Thanks be to God. Amen.